The next step is certainly about then starting to think about focus. What is going to be the particular target that we go on to talk about? And in fact, that question you mentioned about, what would you like us to what would be most helpful for you or whatever, that's a kind of a focusing question, because it offers them the chance to tell you what really is going to be important for us to use this time for. So we want to try to help the client choose the target behaviour, and there might be many things. In fact, sometimes there's quite a clear focus anyway. A good example of that is where basically, well, let's just say the person's calling the quit line, and it's a smoking cessation line. So the focus is about smoking. Partly that's kind of understood. But often there'll be a whole bunch of different options that we can talk about, and sometimes it actually can be really unclear. The person's very unclear about what they're actually wanting to discuss next or talk about. Sometimes desire change talk. When people talk about what they'd like to do, what their preference would be, what their priorities are, that gives us clues about what we need to focus the conversation on. So I'm going to get you to do another little exercise together in pairs. Your client presents following a recent stroke. He seems to be playing down the effects of this stroke despite the observable physical impairment as well as possible low mood. Since the stroke, he's been talking a lot about going back to work, but has not yet met with the rehabilitation team or begun rehabilitation. He's continuing to smoke cigarettes and spends most of his days laying on the couch watching TV. So in pairs, what I'll get you to do is just have a think about how would you go about helping this client to focus? What sort of little tricks of the trade might you use to help them focus the conversation? What would you focus on, if anything? How would you guide focusing in this case? But also, what might some of the sensitivities and dangers be of trying to focus this person in? Namely, how would you balance their goals with your goals as well? So just turn to the person next to you in pairs or groups of three and just have a bit of a think about those 4 or 5 questions about this case. Just for a few minutes. Off you go. There's been some intent conversation going on there. Sorry to interrupt. How would you go about helping this client to focus?
Work is what he wants to do. He wants to work.
Okay.
He wants to get back to work, so what does he miss about work?
So, yeah, I think this is really interesting, that the whole sort of unrealistic prognosis-y type things needn't mean that we avoid the topic. Like this is his priority at the moment. This is what he's talking a lot about. Let's let him voice that. Let's let him talk about it in a way that he doesn't feel that someone's trying to convince him otherwise, and he can maybe start to explore it for himself, because there may come a point where out of his mouth comes, there probably is a couple of things I need to do before I can actually get back to work. So yeah, given that's been one of the things he's talked a lot about, using that feedback from him, that's the thing to maybe focus on. Okay. Other people have different thoughts than that?
But he didn't have much insight in his condition. He's lying about, he wants to go to work. He's verbalized that. But he's lying about all the time. He's not doing anything. And the question is, does he have insight?
Okay. Yeah. So how would you focus him then on that kind of train of conversation? How would you bring that up? It's difficult, did someone say? Right. Oh, look at the time. I'm getting out of here. Yeah. No, I think this is right. You know what? It's interesting. This came up in the last group as well, this concept of insight. And I don't know, you guys are the ones that know about stroke, not me, and it does seem like this is a real challenge that you face, is how much insight does the person have into all of these things. On the other hand, I have this kind of little fluffy view that people also do know stuff. That it's not many people who are insightless, if you know what I mean. And so there are some people, of course, who have suffered cognitive impairment, brain damage to the point where that's the case. But so it's interesting to think, how could we ask a question or talk to the person in a way that helps them to start to consider, you know, how lying on the couch really fits with this notion of going to work? I think we just answered the thing.
Yeah, well, one of the directing along that, which we talked about, was saying, well, have you noticed any changes in your life, you know, that the stroke has affected, you know, like any changes in his daily life?
Or even what are some changes
that's what I'm saying.
that you've noticed in your daily life? Or you could even ask, I noticed you mentioned a couple of things. I just was curious how you thought about this. What are your thoughts about this idea of work and how, you know, I mean, it's a very important piece for you, and how that fits with currently where you're at with your life, and a lot of your time is spent kind of fairly inactive at home. What are your thoughts about those two pieces? So you may actually do it by what we call developing a discrepancy and just sort of delivering back to them the two things and putting them side by side and seeing what the person thinks.
So along those lines, could you maybe be even more direct? Could you be more direct and practical in the sense of, so what is your work? What do you need to do? And sort of try and bring out what that person's tasks are.
Yep.
Which might still develop then that discrepancy between laying about doing nothing versus...
Yes. Yep. I think that would be the thing when you were asking about work, you'd be listening carefully for those sorts of things, and then you would reflect little bits back, you know, you know, your work really involved 4 12-hour shifts a week, you know, that sounds like it would be sort of take quite a bit to get back into. What would be some of the little steps that maybe you'd need to do first? Well, first of all, I need to get off the couch, kind of thing. Beg your pardon?
I'm sorry, but you know, I've got a son who works 10 days a week, comes home for 4 days, he lies on the couch or sits in front of the computer, he doesn't smoke, which is I'm grateful for. But maybe this is in fact what he does at home all the time.
Important to check.
Not a discrepancy at all. He might just have a work life and lying in front of the couch.
Great example of how we might make a wrong assumption that his inactivity is about his stroke. It might be about his premorbid personality or whatever we want to call that. So really good point. We'd want to check that out. Yeah. What might be some of the sensitivities? I think you just raised one. I've always been like this. I love TV. You know, I used to go to work and watch TV all the time. So I think that's good. You know, there are these little sensitivities where all the time we're looking for little signals from the client if we've started to push too much in a focusing way to our agenda and not enough to their agenda. But other insensitivities, do you think? Other sensitivities? Smoking. Here we go again, you people talking to me about smoking. Sick of it. Yeah. Right.
I think the low mood's an issue too, if that is the case.
Yeah.
If we make discrepancy too obvious to him, he may just say,
Ooh, this is important. So we don't want our discrepancies to shame him and just to make him feel even worse about himself. Yep,
and
nice.
not focusing on like these activities that are negative, like you're smoking, you're lying around and watching TV. It might be really to just look past that and think, well, why are you just doing those activities, and how does that make you feel, those activities, rather than just judging them as they are in black and white.
So, yes, trying to, I guess empathise with that side of the ledger and to realise that there might be some reasons for it for him, you know, the perfectly legitimate. Yeah, yeah. Someone said a really interesting thing in the last one, which is a similar point, I think, and it's the idea that work and him talking about work may actually be because work symbolises something about who he used to be. And it's a bit like what you're saying, that these particular behaviours may mean more to him than just what they look like they mean at first glance. It might be that his talking about work is because he just wants to get back there because he wants to be who he always was. It might be that his lying on the couch is because at least then it's not obvious to himself or anyone else that he's actually had a stroke, and so he's able to, you know, kind of avoid having to think about it. So yeah, I think that's really important, that there can be various functions to the sorts of things that people might be talking about. Now, I was just going to get you guys, these are some suggestions, just there's many, many, many of them, but I was just going to see, when I read through this, see if a shape starts to appear in your head. Tell me more about how you feel about how your life is going. What do you think might be influencing how well you're feeling or what you're achieving? What sorts of factors related to your lifestyle in particular are you aware of that influence your quality of life? Would you mind if we spoke a little bit more about your work specifically? And tell me more about your thoughts to do with work and how it fits with the kind of life you want to lead. Did a shape appear in anyone's mind?
Circle.
Circle. It's not the shape I had in mind, but who said circle? Okay, yeah. Feels circular? Okay.
Or concentric, you're kind of coming in on a bit of a target.
Yes. A little bit sort of like a sort of a shark circling in. Yeah, well, that's not great. But I had a sort of a cone shape in my mind, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things with focusing is no one question is going to nail what the focus is. There is a bit of a flow that we go on. We start a bit broad, we hone it in a little bit, we make a few hunches and hone it in a bit more, and then eventually we sort of say, would you mind if we talk about this bit in particular? And we get their permission to go on and talk about that. So yeah, the idea was sort of a bit of a cone-shaped narrowing of the focus. The importance of evoking. Trying to now, once we've engaged, once we've focused in on what the conversation is going to be, we then start asking them what they think about that, what their views are, what their perspective is. We want to make the case for change personally relevant for them. For example, does anyone here like chocolate? What would you say if I told you that there's been this recent case study that suggested that chocolate actually can kill, and that this person, died from eating chocolate. So, you probably shouldn't eat chocolate. What would you say to me? You'd just shake your head. Hey? Make no difference. And what's that? That's a nice story, yes. Doesn't apply to me.
It takes actually 5 kilograms of chocolate until you and I get 5 kilograms.
No, 4.9 is all you're going to get to. Yes, people start to kind of argue. What if I said, okay, well, there's actually been a couple of randomised control trials now, and with larger sample sizes, and it's not about mortality so much, but it is bad for you. Chocolate seems to have these bad kind of things. What would you say to that? Die with a smile on my face? Yeah, right. What was that one? It's worth it. It's worth it? It's worth it? Wow. Yeah. My grandmother ate chocolate till she was 94 and she never died of chocolate consumption. Yeah. And I think this is the piece with evoking. People don't tend to be convinced by things like, the evidence or the research, or the research tells us, or things like that. It's useful and it's worth discussing with them sometimes in a conversational way, but we're not going to convince people with that, because what they do is they try to convince us back, just like you guys all did about chocolate just then. So what we're really wanting to do is to elicit change talk. We want to get them telling us about their arguments for making this change, or taking this action, or joining the rehab program, or starting to walk at home, or stop smoking, whatever it might be. We want to get them to tell us their arguments. And it's things like desire, what they might say about what they'd like to change, what their preferences are, what their priorities are, or their ability, how. It's always great to ask people how they think they would make this change, or what they feel would work for them. Reason, why? Why make this change? What are their reasons? And it's not about our reasons and why we think they should do it. We want to try to evoke from them why they think they would do it, and what might make it important. And ultimately, we want to sort of have people committing to some sort of action, often committing to something smaller, but committing to that strongly is often a good place to get to. So I often use the analogy of getting married. When you get married and the celebrant says to you, will you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I'd like to. No, I can't say that. I could, is ability. I have reason to, is a worry, but that's reasons. I need to. No, what we say is I will. And so we want to get from arguments for change, what I'd like to change, how I do it, why I do it, and why I need it, to a place of commitment to change. This is what I will do. Is I will start to go for a walk 3 mornings a week or whatever it might be. It doesn't guarantee anything. It just ups the chances that they might actually do this if they strongly commit to it and voice that to you. We're not going to talk about planning very much, beyond the idea that at some point we do want to sort of assist the person to develop an action plan, and it will involve some advice giving where relevant. I think the best way to offer advice is with permission first. So would you mind type of a kind of permission gaining to start with. So I'm just going to show you another little video just prior to finishing off. What was the last thing she said? I can't. Yeah. And that's what we're wanting to avoid. If we sort of tell people what they've got to go and do, and I mean, sometimes it's tempting. We know just what they should do, and it will all be better. But if we do that, they'll come back with, but I can't, or it won't work for me, or I don't have time, or I don't have the right support, or whatever it might be. So we're really wanting to instead, kind of create these kind of things where even in the planning, the client feels understood. They feel comfortable and safe to commit to something. They've arrived at a clear plan and they've received helpful advice. So they do, advice is important too. It's just giving it in a way that where they also feel accepted and respected. Not pressured, pushed or judged. Confident. Often confidence is a big part of the planning and coming up with something that the person kind of believes that they will actually be able to do. And an intention, a commitment to actually carrying out the plan. Again, sometimes there's a clear plan through to something more unclear, and we're wanting to sort of create a negotiated plan or a first step for them to do. All right, so I suppose I've tried to really kind of introduce to you a couple of things. Firstly, these 4 processes. And so when you're next with a client, have a think. The first thing is about engagement. How do I engage this person, create a sense of safety, trust, and so on. Secondly, focus. All right, now I need to find some guided focus. I don't want to push them too hard because they'll start pushing back, but we want to try to come to some focus about what this conversation is about. And then thirdly, evoking. I'll start asking questions, getting them to convince me about this action, about this change, about these priorities, and so on. And finally, this kind of notion of a negotiated plan. The big piece in amongst all of that, running through all of that, is the reflective listening. Using open questions, affirmations, reflections and summaries. Ask, not telling, reflecting and affirming, building a sense of confidence and all of those kinds of things.